Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and selamat sejahtera to our panel. My name is Amal bin Rajman and my teammate name is REDZA bin BADRUL HISHAM. And for our present today, for our study, which is the topic's name is tax compliance among civil servant, a case study in state Selangor, which is our study are more focus on tax compliance among civil servant in Selangor. So without further ado, we proceed to the next slide. For the research background, tax compliance or lack of tax or tax non-compliance has been common topics of public policy throughout history, while being a global issue and a phenomena that has exists for the decades. There is relatively recent attention to the subject as a research area for both tax non-compliance and tax evasion. According to SAINS study, the most consistently significant factor in understanding the enforcement conduct of taxpayer is their enforcement mindset. And this shown that it can be concluded that conduct about tax enforcement or tax compliance is a major challenge faced by all countries around the world. Various worldwide studies have consistently shown that tax enforcement habits are low in high-income countries and much lower in medium and low-income countries. Due to that, a systematic study needs to be carried out in order to better comprehend the tax compliance behavior among the taxpayer. Or for this study is for civil servant. For problem statement, in general, tax revenue can be defined as a revenue collected from tax on salary and profit, social security, tax levied on goods and service, payroll tax, tax and ownership, and transfer of property and other tax, according to OECD data. Total tax revenue as a percentage GDP indicates the share of a country output that is collected by the government through tax. It can be regarded as one measure of the degree to which the government controls the economic resources. In easy word, tax is one source of revenue for government and country to collect. So many countries of government throughout the world rely on tax revenue of a source of income. Like Malaysia, achieve 56% of total federal government revenue came from tax, in which 40.3% came from income tax, according to Federal Government Budget, Ministry of Finance 2019. As from the whole tax portion, income tax is the highest contributor, followed by the companies tax and petroleum tax, which is individual and corporate tax are a big contribution in Malaysia tax in collecting a revenue. However, in 2018, the Inland Revenue Board has identified 79,786 eligible taxpayers who fail to pay their income tax. The number included individual, company and organization that own extraordinary amount of property and wealth but fail to declare their assets. Some individuals still refuse to comply with tax in order to avoid spending money in taxation. According to Tun Dr. Muhammad Mahathir in 2019, there are some taxpayers who fail to meet the obligation and were willing to use various means to escape paying tax. Based on discussion, it can be determined that level of voluntary compliance is still low beside effort taken by the Inland Revenue Board to improve voluntary tax compliance, and there is still large room for improvement. There is a number of tax compliance studies undertaken in Malaysia with the aim to improve the level of voluntary compliance among taxpayers. But the issue of voluntary tax compliance still persists and thus remain a worthy area to be explored. For research objective in our study is, for the number one is to examine the relationship between attitude and tax compliance behavior among civil servants. The research question we provide, which is, does attitude influence the tax compliance among civil servants? For the second research objective, which is to determine the relationship between subjective norm and tax compliance among civil servants. For the question we provide, which is, does subjective norm influence tax compliance among civil servants? For the third research objective in our study is to determine the relationship between perceived behavior control and tax compliance among civil servants. For the question we provide, which is whether perceived behavior control influence to community tax compliance among civil servants. For conceptual framework, we provide independent variable, which consists of 3 variables, which is attitude, subjective norm, and perceived behavior control. Meanwhile, independent variable with tax compliance among civil servants. We also consider of independent variable in our study, which attitude. The hypothesis that provide is H0, where there is no significant relationship between attitude and tax compliance behavior. Meanwhile, in H1 there is a significant relationship between attitude and tax compliance. Whereby in subjective norm, in second variable, which is subjective norm, is H0 there is no significant relationship between subjective norm and tax compliance behavior. And H2 is where there is significant relationship between subjective norm and tax compliance behavior. For third variable, which is perceived behavior control, for the H0 there is no significant relationship between perceived behavior control and tax compliance behavior. For H3 there is significant relationship between perceived behavior control and tax compliance behavior.
Assalamualaikum and hello, my name is REDZA. Today I will explain about the research method. So for the research design, the present study used quantitative approach as its methodology. This is because quantitative method is the finest method in explaining a phenomenon. Next, for the unit of analysis, the unit of analysis of this study is individuals, which are employees of the public sector or civil servant. Illustrative example for this unit of analysis is about tax compliance among civil servants. Next, for the sample size, the population of this study is active employees in Selangor, approximately around 1,921,904 in 2018. So this study will be targeted Selangor civil servants as respondent. For the sampling technique, the sample of the present study was selected using simple random sampling. We used a randomizer to pick a government agency. Researchers apply convenience sampling to find the people that will be the respondent. And for the data measurement, the measurement that we use for all of the variables are scale measurement. For the data collection, primary data collection for the quantitative data collection methods are based in mathematical calculation in various formats. Methods of quantitative data collection and analysis is contain questionnaire with closed-ended question, methods of correlation and regression, median, mode, mean, and others. For the data analysis, the analysis of this study will be carried out using statistical package for social science SPSS. This includes conversion of raw data to form that will give information to give details of a set of factors in a situation, and this happens through ordering and adjusting of the raw data collected. The data analysis that will be used is payment correlation.
Okay, for the finding in our study for the tax compliance among civil servants in a study of Selangor State, which is we can see that the majority for our respondent is a female, which reached 60.2%. Meanwhile, for the age 26 to 30 years old, which achieved 60.2%, and for the race Malay, in our respondent, a majority Malay, which is achieves 90.3%. And for educational level, we can see that the bachelor degree are a majority in our respondent, which achieve 54.8%. And for annual income for civil servant that have been response for our study, the majority of annual income are less than 40,000, which is 53.8%. And file income tax achieve, the majority are achieved not once, which is considered higher for 34.4%. For hypothesis testing, for first variable, which is attitude, to examine the relationship attitude and tax compliance behavior, we use non-parametric correlation. The result shown that R value is 0.561 and P value equals 0.000. This can be conclude or hypothesis can accept, which is H1 being accepted and reject H null, which is there is a significant relationship between attitude and tax compliance behavior. For the second variable in our study, which is subjective norm, the research objective is to examine the relationship between subjective norm and tax compliance behavior. We also use non-parametric correlation, and the result shows negative 0.050 for the R value and P value equal to 0.636. The hypothesis that we show is H null are accepted and rejected H2, which means there is no significant relationship between subjective norm and tax compliance behavior. For the third hypothesis testing, the RO for our study is to examine the relationship between perceived behavior control and tax compliance behavior. We also use non-parametric correlation, and the result shows for the R value is 0.088, while for the P value is 0.404. And also the hypothesis H null are accepted and rejected H3, which is there is no significant relationship between between perceived behavior control and tax compliance behavior.
So the first point for research recommendation is conduct a campaign about tax compliance. By doing so, we can create an awareness among all the citizens, especially the one that are employed. The taxpayers must start from their own through their belief that it is compulsory to pay the taxes. When government can show evidence that the tax money are being used for development, people will start to create a perception that the money of the tax are being well spent. So the next point is teaching the younger generation the importance of paying taxes. By starting to teach them about the importance of paying tax at young age, they will grow up and become a person that understands why they should pay the taxes when they are working in the future. So next recommendation is stricter tax law enforcement. By enhancing the culture of fear concerning the tax law, people will be afraid not to comply to the tax law. With the existence of stricter rules and regulation that will search for those who do tax evasion, people will have a perception that they are afraid to do such unlawful act. It will ensure individuals' attitude comply with the tax law. First point for limitation of study and future recommendation is tax compliance among private sector employee. The statistics of private sector employee are extremely hard, thus researchers need to be more specific in their finding in the future. As our study only focus on the civil servant, future researchers can do findings and studies on how well the private sector employee complies to tax law. Next point is cover a wider area and bigger sample size such as the whole country. We only focus on one state, which is Selangor, so we would like to recommend to future researchers if they have enough resources to conduct the same title of study, which is tax compliant, but cover all around Malaysia. And the last point is difficulty to get the right amount of sample size. Researchers face some difficulty while conducting the study, thus it affected the process of distributing the questionnaire. Recommendation to future researchers is to always be ready because any emergency can happen during the process of the study. Future researchers should have contingency plan to ensure that their study can be continued without any issue if any unforeseen problem occur. So in conclusion, there are a lot of things that we have learned throughout the process of completing this study. Study on this subject has always been viewed as a significant concern for corporate and even for the government. It identifies numerous channels through which taxation can affect growth. Every employee that is eligible to pay taxes should be responsible and act accordingly. It has been proven that how vital tax money is in order to develop our country. If people stop paying tax anymore, country will face hardship in order to develop their countries. So that's all from me and my teammates. Thank you.